The work began like any other. On the morning of October 16th, 1869, on the farm of William Stubb Newell in the quiet hamlet of Cardiff, New York, a pair of laborers were hired for a simple task: to dig a well. The air was damp, the ground was soft, and the expectation was for a day of hard, ordinary labor, ending with the promise of fresh water drawn from the earth. But 3 feet down, a shovel struck something unyielding. It had the flat, grating feel of bedrock, yet it seemed too shallow, too isolated. The men, thinking it a large, buried stone, began to dig around it. With each shovelful of damp soil, their frustration gave way to curiosity. The object was too smooth, too regular. It had shape, it had form. Slowly, carefully, they cleared away the earth, and the true nature of their discovery began to emerge. First, what looked like an enormous foot, its toes perfectly defined, then a leg, then the gigantic torso and powerful arms of a man, all seemingly turned to solid stone. As they cleared the soil from its head, they uncovered a face, its features twisted in an expression of ancient, silent agony. Lying in the pit before them was a figure of impossible scale, a 10-foot giant locked within the earth. The news of the discovery spread with the speed of a telegraph wire, first to neighbors, then to the city of Syracuse, and then to the entire nation. A giant, unearthed from a farmer's field. Was it the petrified remains of an ancient man, proof of the biblical passages that spoke of giants walking the earth? Was it a masterfully carved statue from some long-vanished, unknown American civilization? Or was it something else entirely? That discovery, in a muddy pit in upstate New York, set in motion a national obsession and began the final chapter in the long, strange history of the belief in giants. But before that final chapter in Cardiff could be written, its first pages had to be inscribed at the very dawn of the world. To understand why a 10-foot giant buried in American soil could captivate a nation, we must first travel to a time when giants were the foundational pillars of the cosmos itself, representing the natural order rather than a buried anomaly. In the Greek imagination, the beginning of all things was chaos, a swirling, ungendered void of pure potential, a universe of possibility waiting to take form. From this generative abyss, the first beings willed themselves into existence. Chief among them was Gaia, the earth, the broad-breasted mother and the unshakable foundation of all future life. Alongside her emerged Tartarus, the dark pit of the underworld, and Eros, the irresistible force of desire that would drive creation forward. Gaia was the stage upon which the entire divine drama would unfold, her very body the source of all that was to come. Alone, Gaia felt her own incompleteness. She longed for a counterpart, an equal to embrace her, and from this desire, she gave birth to a son who would also be her partner, Ouranos, the starry sky. He rose from her to cover her completely, an unfathomable celestial dome that mirrored her own terrestrial expanse. Earth and sky, mother and father, they were the first divine couple, their union the bedrock of the new divine order. Their children were the first true dynasty of gods, beings of immense power and scale. These were the 12 Titans, 6 sons and 6 daughters who embodied the fundamental features of the world. There was Oceanus, the river that encircled the globe, Rhea, the mother of the future Olympians, and the youngest, most ambitious of them all, the calculating Cronus. They were the first generation to hold dominion over the universe, a pantheon of giants who ruled from a world still cooling from the fires of its own creation. Their father, Uranos, however, looked upon his powerful children with a primal and defining terror. He saw in their strength a future challenge to his own authority. Fearing the prophecy that his own offspring would overthrow him, he refused to let them see the light. As each Titan was born, he forced them back into the depths of their mother, imprisoning them in the darkness of the earth. This act of cruel tyranny, this suppression of the future by the present, would not go unanswered. It was a crime against nature itself, and it planted the seeds of the universe's first and most terrible war. That seed of war found fertile ground in the heart of Gaia herself. Groaning with the pressure of her imprisoned children, she resolved to end the tyranny of Uranos. From her own essence, she forged a new, unnatural element, adamant, a metal of grey and unbreakable hardness, and fashioned it into a terrible sickle. She then conspired with her children, offering this weapon to whichever of them dared to rise up and overthrow their father. Only one had the courage. Cronus, the youngest and most cunning of the Titans, took the sickle from his mother. He lay in wait as Uranos, the starry sky, descended to embrace Gaia. In a moment of world-altering violence, Cronus ambushed his own father, seizing him and swinging the adamantine blade. With one brutal act, he severed Uranos from his power and his partner, casting him into eternal darkness. The age of the sky was over. The age of the Titans had begun. Crowned as the new king of the universe, Cronus took his sister Rhea as his queen and presided over a golden age. But the primal crime that brought him to power left an indelible stain on his reign. His dying father had cursed him with a prophecy that he too would be overthrown by his own son. Consumed by the same paranoia that had driven Uranos to cruelty, Cronus devised a chilling solution. As Rhea gave birth to his children, the next generation of gods, the Olympians, he seized each infant and swallowed them whole, imprisoning them within his own body. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, all were consumed by their father, their divine light seemingly extinguished in the darkness of his paranoia. But Rhea, heartbroken, could not bear to lose her final child. When she gave birth to her son Zeus, she hid him away on the island of Crete. In his place, she wrapped a large stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to her husband. Blinded by his fear, Cronus swallowed the stone without a second thought, believing he had finally defeated his prophesied doom. He had only delayed the inevitable. Raised in secret, Zeus grew into a god of remarkable power and charisma, his mind burning with the need for justice. Upon reaching adulthood, he returned in disguise and tricked Cronus into drinking a potion that forced him to disgorge his siblings, now grown and whole. The stone came out first, followed by the 5 Olympians, armed and ready for vengeance. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Cronus and the elder Titans, ruling from their fortress peak of Mount Othrys. On the other, the young Olympians, led by Zeus from the slopes of the newly ascendant Mount Olympus. The war that followed, the Titanomachy, was a conflict that shook the foundations of the cosmos for 10 long years. This was a war fought with the raw power of creation itself, a conflict where mountains were hurled as javelins, and the thunderbolt was the ultimate siege weapon. Yet for a decade, neither side could gain the advantage. The raw power of the Titans was perfectly matched by the ferocious energy of the Olympians, and the universe was locked in a devastating stalemate. It was Gaia who once again tipped the scales. She advised Zeus to seek allies in the deepest pit of the earth, the very place where Uranos had imprisoned her other children, the one-eyed Cyclopes, masters of the forge, and the 100-handed Hecatoncheires, beings of unstoppable strength. Zeus descended into Tartarus and freed them. In gratitude, the Cyclopes forged for him his iconic weapon, the Thunderbolt. With these new, terrifying allies and a weapon that could splinter mountains, the Olympians launched their final assault, and the Age of the Titans was brought to a fiery and decisive end. With this fiery end came a new beginning. Victory for the Olympians was absolute, and their first act was to ensure that the old powers could never rise again. The defeated Titans, including their king Cronus, were bound in chains forged by the Cyclopes and cast down into the deepest, darkest abyss of the universe, Tartarus. The very same pit where they had been imprisoned was now made into the eternal jail for their rivals. Guarded by the loyal, 100-handed Hecatoncheires, the prison of Tartarus was a place of absolute finality. It was said to be as far beneath the earth as the earth was beneath the heavens, a void of blackness and silence where the memory of light and power could fade into nothingness. For most of the Titans, this was their final fate, to be removed from the story of the universe, their massive power neutralized forever in the silent dark. But for a few, Zeus reserved a special punishment, a sentence tailored to their specific role in the war. The most famous of these was the general of the Titan army, Atlas. For the crime of leading the war against Olympus, he was condemned to stand at the western edge of the world and bear the entire weight of the heavens upon his shoulders for all eternity. His punishment was to become a pillar of the new order, his strength forever co-opted into the service of his enemies. With their predecessors imprisoned or condemned, Zeus and the Olympians solidified their rule. They were a new kind of god, more specific, more refined, and more deeply intertwined with the burgeoning world of humanity. They represented a universe of laws, domains, and hierarchies, a cosmos where brute force was now superseded by intelligence, strategy, and order. Mount Olympus became the shining symbol of this new government, a beacon of divine authority in a world finally at peace. The Titans were gone, but they were never forgotten. They became a foundational memory, a cautionary tale about the chaos that preceded order, the untamed world that existed before civilization. They were the giants who had to be defeated for the world of gods and, eventually, the world of mortals to thrive. This idea of a primordial race of giants whose defeat was a necessary precondition for the current age would echo across countless cultures, becoming one of humanity's most essential and enduring myths. One of the most powerful of these echoes is found in the frostbitten landscapes of the North. Unlike the starborn Titans, the giants of the North were creatures of elemental chaos, forged in a crucible of primordial extremes. In the Norse worldview, the cosmos began with Ginnunga Gap, a great and yawning emptiness that separated two primordial realms. To the south lay Muspelheim, a realm of eternal incandescent fire, home to the fire giants and their sweltering heat. To the north lay Niflheim, a world of unending ice, frozen fog, and bitter cold. For eons, these two forces existed in opposition. Then, the hot winds of Muspelheim began to blow across the vast void, meeting the frozen rivers flowing from Niflheim. In the heart of Ginnunga Gap, fire met ice. The ice began to thaw and drip, and from these life-giving drops, a new form began to coalesce in the void. This was Ymir, the first being, the ancestor of all giants. He was a being of pure, unthinking creation, embodying the raw, untamed potential of the new cosmos. He was a creature of instinct and enormous scale, his body formed from the churning chaos of the thaw. As Ymir slept, he began to sweat. From the moisture in his left armpit, a male and female giant were born. From his legs, a third son with 6 heads emerged. These were the first of the Jotnar, the frost giants, a race born as an almost accidental byproduct of a sleeping primordial body, their origin a matter of chaotic chance rather than divine will. Their nature was forever tied to this chaotic, elemental origin. While the giants were being born from Ymir's body, a second creation was also taking place. From the primordial thaw, a great, hornless cow named Audumbla was formed. Desperate for sustenance, she began to lick the salty, rime-covered ice blocks that littered the void. For 3 days, she licked. On the first day, the hair of a man appeared. On the second day, his head. And on the third day, the entire being was freed from the ice. This was Buri, the first of the gods. Born not from a giant's flesh, but licked into existence from the primordial ice by a cosmic cow, his origin was fundamentally separate from that of the Jotnar. He was a being of form, purpose, and nascent order, standing in stark contrast to the chaotic, elemental nature of Ymir's descendants. The 2 founding races of the Norse universe had been born, and the lines of their inevitable conflict were drawn in the very ice and fire of creation. That inevitable conflict was ignited by the grandsons of Buri, the 3 gods, Odin, Vili, and Ve. These descendants of the first being, known as the Aesir, embodied the principles of order, functioning as both warriors who defended the cosmos and architects who built its structure. They looked upon Ymir and his chaotic, endlessly spawning children and saw a universe of untamed, meaningless growth. To build a world with purpose, the source of its chaos had to be eliminated. In a foundational act of world-shaping violence, the 3 brother gods attacked and killed the giant Ymir. The flood of blood that poured from his wounds was so substantial that it drowned almost the entire race of Jotnar, a significant deluge that washed the primordial void clean. Only 2 giants, Bergelmir and his wife, survived by climbing onto a wooden box, ensuring that the race of giants would endure to become the eternal adversaries of the gods. From Ymir's corpse, Odin and his brothers began to construct the known universe. This defeat was also a complete repurposing of the giant's very essence. They laid his body in the center of Ginnungagap to form the earth of the mortal realm, Midgard. His blood became the oceans and rivers. His bones were raised up to become the mountains, and his teeth and shattered bone fragments became the rocks and stones. They took his colossal skull and set it above the earth to form the dome of the sky. His brains were tossed into the air to become the clouds, and sparks from the fiery realm of Muspelheim were set into his skull to become the sun, moon, and stars. The world of mortals was built entirely from the dismembered body of the first giant, a constant, physical reminder of the violent act of creation that allowed for its existence. Having built the world, the Aesir established their own realm, Asgard, a celestial fortress of order and light, connected to Midgard by a shimmering rainbow bridge. For the surviving Jotnar, they assigned the harsh, chaotic outer world of Jotunheimer, a place of dark forests, high mountains, and eternal winter. From these two strongholds, the two races would wage a perpetual war, a conflict defined by skirmishes, raids, and an unending, simmering tension. The primary defender of Asgard against the giants was Odin's most famous son, the thunder god, Thor. Armed with his unstoppable warhammer, Mjolnir, Thor was the perfect champion of order, his thunderbolts a constant warning to any giant who dared to encroach upon the territory of gods or men. The stories of his battles with the Jotnar form the core of Norse mythology, a testament to the unending struggle to keep the forces of chaos at bay. The relationship, however, was a complex web of bitter rivalry, strategic intermarriage, and shared bloodlines, making the conflict less a war against a foreign enemy and more a bitter, endless family feud. But this endless family feud was never destined to remain in a stalemate. The entire Norse cosmos existed in the shadow of a prophecy, a detailed foretelling of a final, world-shattering battle known as Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. And the key agent of this destruction was a figure who walked the line between both families. Loki, a giant by birth, who was adopted into the Aesir through a blood oath with Odin, a trickster whose cunning and chaotic nature made him the ultimate catalyst for doom. Through his giantess mistress, Loki fathered the three greatest monsters destined to ravage the heavens and the earth. There was Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, a creature so enormous that Odin cast him into the sea, where he grew to encircle the entire world, biting his own tail. And there was Fenrir, a wolf of such terrifying strength and insatiable hunger that the gods were forced to bind him with a magical chain, a beast destined to swallow the sun. These children of the giant bloodline were both enemies and living time bombs planted at the heart of creation. The prophecy of Ragnarok unfolds with the breaking of all bonds. Loki, imprisoned for his crimes, shatters his fetters. Fenrir snaps his magical chains. The great serpent stirs, releasing his tail and causing the oceans to flood the land. From Jotunheimer, the frost giants march forth, sailing on a ship made from the fingernails of the dead. And from the fiery realm of Muspelheim, the fire giant Surtur emerges, his flaming sword burning brighter than the sun, ready to fulfill his ancient purpose. The final battle is a series of fated, mutual destruction. The god Heimdall and Loki kill each other. Odin, the All-Father, is finally devoured by the wolf Fenrir. And Thor, the champion of Asgard, confronts his ancient nemesis, the Midgard serpent. He slays the beast with a final, mighty blow from Mjolnir, but is drowned in its venomous death spray, taking only 9 steps before he falls dead. Each victory is an annihilation, as the cosmos systematically unmakes itself. In the end, it is Surtur who casts his fire over all of creation, burning the heavens and the earth and cleansing the universe in a final, sterilizing inferno. The world sinks back into the sea, returning the cosmos to the watery void from which it came. Yet in the Norse view, this is not a true end. Ragnarok represented both the final, violent end of the old world and the necessary catalyst for a new one. After the flames, a new green earth is prophesied to rise from the sea, ready for a new generation of gods and men. In this worldview, the giants were the ultimate engines of cosmic renewal, the agents of a destruction so complete that it was the only thing that could allow life to begin again, pure and unburdened by the past. The Norse story of a world built from the flesh and bone of the giant Ymir is a concept of startling and elemental power. It transforms the giant from a simple adversary into the very substance of reality itself, making the landscape a constant monument to a primordial sacrifice. This idea of a world born from the dismemberment of a divine giant is a powerful archetype that surfaces in foundational myths across the globe. This figure, often called the cosmic man, represents the ultimate unity of the microcosm and the macrocosm, the idea that the universe and the body are built from the same divine pattern. In ancient Chinese mythology, this pattern begins with a state of perfect, undifferentiated wholeness. The entire universe was contained within a single cosmic egg, where all the forces of yin and yang swirled together in a dark, sleeping chaos. For 18,000 years, this egg incubated, and within it, a being took shape. Pangu, the first living thing, a horned and primeval giant. Upon awakening, Pangu stretched, and the force of his movement shattered the egg. The lighter, purer elements of the eggshell drifted upwards to form the heavens, while the heavier, impure elements sank to form the earth. Fearing they would merge again into chaos, Pangu stood between them, his head holding up the sky and his feet planted firmly on the earth. For another 18,000 years he grew, pushing them further apart, functioning as the living, growing axis of the new universe. When the heavens and the earth were finally stable, Pangu's task was complete, and he lay down to die. And just as with Ymir, his body became the world, his breath became the wind and the clouds, his voice became the thunder, his left eye became the sun, and his right eye became the moon. His limbs became the 4 cardinal directions, his blood the rivers, his muscles the fertile soil, and the hair on his head became the stars in the sky. Every feature of the world was a direct, physical legacy of the giant who created it. This same archetype finds a unique and powerful expression in the Vedic traditions of ancient India, as described in the sacred hymns of the Rig Veda. Here, the cosmic man is Purusha. He is described as a being of 1,000 heads and 1,000 feet, so colossal that he encompassed the entire earth and extended beyond it by 10 fingers' breadth. He wasn't a part of the universe. He was the universe. All that has been and all that will be was contained within his singular, magnificent form. The creation of the world from Purusha, however, was a deliberate ritual sacrifice performed by the first gods. They laid the being upon a sacred altar and dismembered him. From this sacrifice, the components of reality were born. The moon was born from his mind, the sun from his eye, and the wind from his breath. But the Vedic myth adds a crucial new dimension. His body also formed the blueprint for human society. From his mouth came the Brahmin, the priestly class. From his arms, the Kshatriya, the warriors. From his thighs, the Vaishya, the merchants. And from his feet, the Shudra, the laborers. In this tradition, the body of the cosmic giant became both the physical world and the very structure of civilization itself. While some cultures saw the giant's body as the foundation of civilization, for the triumphant Olympians, the age of cosmic creation was over. The age of cosmic war, however, was not. Their new order was built upon the imprisonment of the Titans, and that act had deeply wounded their ancient grandmother, Gaia. The earth fumed, her rage festering over the fate of her firstborn children, locked away in Tartarus. In her fury, she spawned a new generation of giants, born from the blood of the castrated Uranos that had once soaked the earth. These new giants, the Gigantes, were distinct from their Titan predecessors. They were monstrous warriors, born for the singular purpose of war. Often depicted with thick, coiling serpents in place of legs, they were chthonic beings, creatures of the deep earth, their forms a grotesque mockery of the shining, perfected bodies of the Olympians. The Gigantes were the physical incarnation of their mother's boundless rage, and their target was the new master of the heavens, Zeus. The assault was immediate and cataclysmic. The Gigantes stormed the slopes of Olympus, hurling entire mountains and burning forests as projectiles. The Olympians met them with the full force of their divine power, Zeus with his thunderbolts, Poseidon with his trident, Apollo with his plague-tipped arrows. Yet for every giant they struck down, the creature would simply fall to the earth, touch their mother Gaia, and rise again, their wounds healed and their rage renewed. The gods soon learned the terrible nature of their predicament. A prophecy had declared that the Gigantes could not be killed by the hand of a god alone. Their final doom could only be delivered by a mortal. To secure their victory and preserve their new cosmic order, the Olympians required a human champion. Their choice was the greatest hero of the age, a demigod son of Zeus himself, renowned for his impossible strength, Heracles. With Heracles fighting at their side, the tide of the war turned. Now, when a god struck down a giant, the mortal hero would rush in to deliver the final, fatal wound before the creature could touch the earth and regenerate. This combined power of immortal and mortal, of divine strategy and human grit, was the one thing the Gigantes could not withstand. Their army was shattered, their rebellion was broken, and the rule of the Olympians was cemented by repelling the monstrous, vengeful children of the earth itself. The age of cosmic progenitors was definitively over. The age of monsters had begun. Perhaps no story from this new age of monsters better illustrates the terror of a world shared with giants than the one recorded by the poet Homer. In his epic, the Odyssey, the focus shifts from the grand wars of the gods to the harrowing journey of a single mortal hero. After the fall of Troy, the cunning king of Ithaca, Odysseus, and his crew are blown far off course into a world of myth and magic that had, until then, existed only at the edges of the map. It is here, on a remote and verdant island, that they come face to face with the new reality of the giant. Drawn by the sight of a massive cave and the promise of supplies, Odysseus and his best men venture inland. They were aware of the island's inhabitants, the Cyclopes, but perhaps they expected beings like the three great artisans who had forged Zeus's thunderbolts. The creatures they found were of a different breed entirely. These were lawless, pastoral people, shepherds who lived in isolation, knowing nothing of gods or laws. Odysseus and his men entered the giant's cave to find it empty, save for pens of lambs and towering racks of cheese. They waited, expecting to make an appeal to the sacred Greek law of xenia, the duty of a host to offer hospitality to a traveler. Their host's arrival was like a localized earthquake. The Cyclops Polyphemus returned, driving his flock before him, and sealing the cave's entrance with a stone so massive that 24 wagons could not move it. He was a creature of terrifying scale, a man-mountain with a single, glaring eye in the center of his forehead. When Odysseus made his appeal for hospitality in the name of Zeus, Polyphemus laughed. He declared that he and his kind cared nothing for the Olympians, and in a shocking, brutal violation of all civilized norms, he seized 2 of Odysseus's men, smashed their heads against the stone floor, and devoured them raw. For Odysseus, this was a horror beyond the battlefield. He was trapped in a cave with a monster that embodied a primal savagery, a being that existed entirely outside the moral universe of gods and men. The giant was a force of nature to be endured, and with the entrance blocked, there was no escape. The next morning, 2 more men were eaten for breakfast. Odysseus, the master of strategy, was reduced to a state of absolute helplessness, forced to watch as his crew was consumed one by one. His sword was useless, for even if he could kill the giant, he would remain trapped in the cave forever. His only weapon was his mind. He enacted his plan that evening. After Polyphemus had eaten 2 more men, Odysseus offered the giant a skin of incredibly strong, unwatered wine. Delighted by the gift, the giant drank greedily and asked for Odysseus's name. The hero replied, "My name is Autis," or Nobody. As the drunken giant finally collapsed into a stupor, Odysseus and his men took their chance. They had found the giant's club, a massive olive branch, and had spent the day sharpening its point in the fire. Together, they hoisted the enormous stake, heated its tip to a glowing ember in the fire, and with all their combined strength, they drove it directly into the Cyclops' single, sleeping eye. The giant's roar of agony shook the very foundations of the mountain. He tore the stake from his face and began to thrash blindly around the cave. His cries brought the other Cyclopes to the outside of the sealed cave, and they called in, asking who was hurting him. Polyphemus could only scream the truth. "Nobody is killing me! Nobody is killing me by treachery." Hearing this, his brothers assumed he was merely sick or divinely cursed, and they departed, leaving him to his fate. The giant was blinded, and the trap of language had been sprung. With the giant blinded and neutralized by his own name, the path to escape was cleared. At dawn, the Cyclops rolled back the stone to let his flock out to graze. He sat in the entrance, his huge hands patting the back of each sheep as it passed, ensuring none of his captives could slip by. But Odysseus had already prepared for this. He had lashed his men to the bellies of the largest rams, while he himself clung to the thick, curly fleece of the flock's great leader. As the final ram passed, Polyphemus lamented to it that its master had been tricked by a wretched creature named Nobody and let it pass, unaware that the agent of his doom was clinging to its underside. Safely back on their ship, Odysseus's hubris overcame his famous cunning. Unable to resist a final boast, he called out to the shore, revealing his true name and taunting the blinded giant. In a final, impotent rage, Polyphemus broke off a piece of the mountain and hurled it at the ship, nearly sinking it. He then prayed to his father, the sea god Poseidon, cursing Odysseus by name and setting in motion the decade of suffering that would define the hero's long journey home. The victory was won, but the price would be immense. The story of the Cyclops is a masterclass in folkloric horror, a perfect cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk beyond the known world. For centuries, it was simply that, a story. In the modern era, however, a compelling scientific theory has emerged that reframes the myth, suggesting the story arose from a perfectly logical, rational, and yet completely incorrect conclusion drawn from a strange and compelling piece of physical evidence. The islands of the Mediterranean, Crete, Sicily, Malta, were once home to a variety of prehistoric dwarf elephants and mammoths. These animals, known as proboscideans, died out long before the rise of Greek civilization, but their fossilized bones remained, weathering out of the hillsides. For an ancient Greek farmer or sailor who stumbled upon them, the bones would have been baffling. The femurs were the size of a man's torso, suggesting a being of gigantic stature, but the most remarkable piece of evidence was the skull. A dwarf elephant skull is a strange and imposing object. While the two true eye sockets are relatively small and set on the sides, the most dramatic feature, located squarely in the center of the forehead, is the large, single nasal opening for the creature's trunk. To a person who had never seen an elephant, who had no concept of a trunk, this central cavity would look like one thing and one thing only: a single, massive eye socket. The conclusion was simple, direct, and inescapable. The bones belonged to a race of giant one-eyed men. The Cyclops was a logical mistake, not a lie. But not all giant myths can be explained by a fossil record. Some arise from a far more mysterious source, from a handful of cryptic, unsettling lines embedded in a sacred text. In the Hebrew Bible, just before the story of Noah and the Great Flood, the book of Genesis presents a brief and enigmatic episode that has haunted theologians and scholars for millennia. It is a story that speaks of a fateful and unnatural union, a transgression that blurred the very lines of creation. The passage in Genesis, chapter 6, describes the world in the generations after Adam. It states that as humanity began to multiply across the face of the earth, the sons of God looked down upon the daughters of men and saw that they were beautiful. Driven by this desire, they descended and took them as wives, choosing whomever they wished from among the mortal population. From these forbidden unions, a new race was born. The text states, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them." The passage concludes by describing these offspring as the Gibborim, the heroes of old, the men of renown. This was a generation of beings who were part human, but also something more, their very existence a testament to a shocking act of divine desire. This passage, though brief, describes a fundamental violation of the created order. In the ancient Hebrew worldview, the realms of the divine and the mortal were meant to be separate. This union represented a category error of the highest magnitude, a willful mixing of the sacred and the profane that introduced a corrupting element into the human bloodline. The Nephilim were a hybrid race, a walking embodiment of this sacred imbalance, and their presence on the earth is presented as a primary symptom of a world spiraling into chaos and corruption. The enduring mystery of the passage lies in its ambiguity. The text's deliberate silence regarding the precise identity of the sons of God has fueled millennia of intense theological debate. Were they fallen angels, celestial beings who abandoned their heavenly station for earthly passions? Or were they merely human, the righteous descendants of Adam's son Seth, who corrupted their holy lineage by intermarrying with the worldly descendants of the murderer Cain? These two interpretations would create very different, though equally compelling histories about the nature of the giants who walked the antediluvian world. While the Sethite interpretation offered a tidy, human-scale explanation for the Genesis passage, it was the fallen angel theory that truly captured the imagination of the ancient world. This interpretation was given its fullest and most terrifying voice in a hugely influential apocryphal text, known as the Book of Enoch. This ancient work, written in the centuries before the birth of Christ, takes the cryptic verses of Genesis 6 and expands them into a full-blown cosmic horror story. In Enoch's telling, the sons of God are a specific legion of 200 celestial beings known as the Watchers. Led by the angel Shemhaza, they were assigned to observe humanity from the holy Mount Hermon. But as they watched, they began to lust after mortal women. Knowing their desire was a grave sin, Shemhaza bound his followers with an oath, a pact of mutual guilt, ensuring that none could back out of their shared transgression. Together, they descended, took human wives, and began a program of illicit education. The Watchers taught humanity a mixture of practical skills and corrupting, forbidden arts that accelerated their downfall. They revealed the secrets of weaponry and metalworking, teaching men how to forge swords and shields. They taught the arts of seduction, of cosmetics and adornment. Most damningly, they revealed heavenly secrets, sorcery, incantations, and astrology, knowledge that humanity was never meant to possess. It was a complete contamination of the mortal world, a deliberate transfer of forbidden power that unraveled the fabric of creation. And from their unions with human women, the Nephilim were born. The Book of Enoch describes these beings in terrifying detail. They were giants in the truest sense, their stature said to be 3,000 cubits tall. Their birth itself was a violation, an unnatural fusion that produced creatures of monstrous appetite. The Nephilim possessed a supernatural and insatiable hunger, an appetite so voracious it threatened to consume all life on Earth. At first, they devoured all the food that humanity could produce. When the fields and storehouses were empty, they turned on the animals, consuming the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, and the fish of the sea. When the animals were gone, they turned on humanity itself, killing and eating the very people who had once sustained them. Finally, in the ultimate act of monstrous depravity, they turned on each other, drinking the blood and devouring the flesh of their own kind. The earth became a slaughterhouse, a world groaning under the weight of these cannibalistic giants who were systematically unmaking creation. Their existence was no longer just a symptom of corruption. It was the active agent of the world's complete and total defilement. The world described by Enoch was a full-scale cosmic rebellion, far exceeding a simple case of intermarriage. A rogue legion of angels had abandoned their post, corrupted humanity with forbidden knowledge, and sired a race of monstrous cannibalistic giants who were devouring the world. The sin of the Watchers had unleashed a plague upon the earth, a crisis so grave that it would require an equally absolute and catastrophic divine response. This catastrophic response was set in motion when the cries of the ravaged earth finally reached the heavens. The souls of the dead, devoured by the Nephilim, cried out for justice. In the Book of Enoch, this appeal is heard by the archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, who look down from the celestial sanctuary and see a world drowning in blood and lawlessness. They bring this report to the Most High, who then passes judgment on the fallen Watchers and the corrupted world they created. The judgment was twofold. First, the Watchers themselves were to be made an example. The archangels were commanded to descend, to bind the ringleaders of the rebellion, and to cast them into the deep places of the earth. They were to be imprisoned in total darkness, bound in chains, and buried under jagged rocks to await the final day of judgment, when they would be cast into the eternal fire. Their punishment was to be isolated and preserved, a timeless monument to the consequences of their crime. Second, their monstrous offspring had to be dealt with. The Lord commanded the archangels to incite the Nephilim into a frenzy of self-destruction, turning them against one another in a final, suicidal war. But even this was insufficient. The taint of their existence was so deep, their physical forms so corrupting, that the very soil and water of the world were defiled. A more complete solution was required. And so God declared his intention to Noah, the one righteous man left in the world. He would bring forth a cataclysmic flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh. The flood was a catastrophic act of divine purification, a complete unmaking of a world that had become irredeemably stained by the Watchers' sin and their giant offspring. It was a baptism of the entire planet, a washing clean that would allow creation to begin anew with the pure, untainted bloodline of Noah and his family. The waters destroyed the physical bodies of the Nephilim, wiping their gigantic forms from the face of the earth. But according to the Enochian tradition, this was not the end of their influence. Their spiritual nature, born from the union of immortal angels and mortal women, could not be so easily erased. As their bodies rotted in the floodwaters, their spirits were released, and they were cursed to remain on the earth as disembodied, malevolent forces. These wandering spirits, forever hungry and forever thirsty, became the source of all future spiritual corruption. They were the demons, the evil spirits who would plague humanity for the rest of time, tempting them, afflicting them, and leading them astray. In this view, the legacy of the Nephilim was the direct theological origin of demonic evil itself. They were the ghosts of the antediluvian world, their influence a permanent scar on the new age of man. This transforms them into one of the most consequential monster myths in human history, the theological justification for a global cataclysm, and the progenitors of all that is demonic. While the giant in the hills of Judea served as a test of a nation's covenant with its God, a very different kind of conflict was taking shape in the damp, green islands of Ireland. Here, the struggle was a more primal battle for the land itself. The giants of Irish myth were the land's first and most terrible masters. They were the Fomorians. In the oldest traditions, the Fomorians are a race of divine beings who represent the dark, chaotic, and destructive powers of nature. They are figures of the abyss, beings who dwell in the cold, dark depths of the ocean or in the hidden places deep beneath the earth. The Fomorians were a fully realized rival society, a magical race with their own kings, fortresses, and a deep, oppressive connection to the natural world. Their physical forms were often described as a monstrous hybrid, some possessing a single eye, a single arm, and a single leg, while others were said to be possessed of a strange and unsettling beauty. The Fomorians held dominion over the first inhabitants of Ireland, ruling them with a cruel and unyielding tyranny. They were the masters of blight and plague, the harbingers of crop failure and failed hunts. From their stronghold on Tory Island, they imposed a terrible tax on the peoples of the mainland. It was a tribute of grain, milk, and, most horrifyingly, a horrifying tribute of their children, who were to be delivered to them as a sacrifice on the festival of Samhain. This resembled an occupation more than a war, an oppressive weight that crushed the life from the land. The Fomorians were a stifling blight upon Ireland, their monstrous power so absolute that it seemed unshakable. But the land was waiting. It was waiting for a new power, a new people of light and magic to arrive from across the sea and challenge the long, dark reign of the giants. That new power arrived from the northern islands of the world, shrouded in a magical mist. They were the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. Where the Fomorians were dark, chthonic, and chaotic, the Tuatha De Danann were beings of light, skill, and high magic. They were a pantheon of gods and heroes, masters of poetry, craftsmanship, and the arts of war. They burned their ships upon arriving in Ireland, a definitive statement that they had come to claim the land as their own. The inevitable conflict was complicated by a web of intermarriage. Many of the most powerful figures, including the Fomorian king, had Tuatha De Danann ancestry, and vice versa. The ultimate hero of the coming war was a product of this union, Lugh Lamfada, or Lugh of the Long Arm. His mother was of the Tuatha De Danann, but his grandfather, the most feared of all the Fomorian champions, was a giant named Bela. Lugh was a master of every art and every craft, a figure of supreme and universal competence who rose to become the leader of the Tuatha De Danann in their war for liberation. The two armies finally met on the Plain of Towers, Mag Tuired. It was a long and brutal conflict. The Fomorian host was a force of overwhelming brute strength, a tide of monstrous giants. The Tuatha De Danann, though outnumbered, fought with magic and strategy. Their physicians and smiths created a well of healing that could restore the wounded, and a magical forge that could instantly repair any broken weapon, allowing them to fight a war of attrition against their more powerful foes. But the Fomorians had an ultimate weapon, a force of such destructive power that it seemed to guarantee their victory. This was Lugh's own grandfather, Bela of the Evil Eye. He was a giant of immense size, but his true power lay in his single, terrible eye. It was an eye so poisonous that it required 4 warriors to lift the heavy eyelid. But once opened, it was a weapon of absolute annihilation, capable of destroying entire armies with a single gaze. As Bela's eyelid was lifted, and his gaze of death began to fall upon the Tuatha De Danann, Lugh unleashed his own attack. With his simple sling, he cast a single stone with supernatural force and perfect accuracy. The stone struck Bela's eye just as it opened, driving it out the back of his head. The giant's own weapon, now facing his own army, unleashed its full destructive power upon the Fomorian ranks, shattering their formations and sowing chaos and death among their champions. The death of Bela broke the Fomorian spirit. Their army was routed, their leaders were killed, and their power was shattered forever. The Tuatha De Danann drove the survivors back into the depths of the sea, liberating Ireland from their tyranny once and for all. The story of Mag Tuired is a classic Celtic iteration of a now familiar theme: the victory of a new, sophisticated generation of gods over a primal, chaotic, and monstrous race of giants, establishing a new order and claiming the world for a new age. This pattern of a new people arriving to claim a land by defeating its primal, giant inhabitants is a foundational story for many nations. In the mythical history of Britain, the role of the Fomorians was played by a race of giants, led by the monstrous Gog-Magog. The medieval chronicles state that when the Trojan refugee Brutus and his followers first arrived in the land they would name Britain, they found it inhabited only by these colossal beings. The story culminates in a wrestling match between Gog-Magog and the hero Coroneus, who defeats the giant by hurling him from a high cliff into the sea, an act that symbolically cleanses the land and establishes the new Trojan-descended dynasty. In the misty mountains of the Basque country, the giants were known as the Gentillac. These were huge, hairy beings who were credited with prodigious strength, capable of throwing massive boulders for miles. They were the builders of the region's megalithic dolmens and the creators of its dramatic rock formations. But the Gentillac were a shy, pagan people, and with the arrival of Christianity, heralded by a mysterious, shining cloud in the sky, they knew their time was over. The arrival of a new faith and a new way of understanding the world rendered the Gentillac obsolete, prompting their retreat into the earth, disappearing forever beneath a great stone, leaving only their monuments behind. Perhaps the most potent version of this theme comes from the other side of the world, in the cosmology of the Aztec Empire. In their creation myth, the universe had passed through 4 previous cycles, or suns, each with its own dominant race, and each ending in cataclysm. The very first of these ages, the sun of the earth, was a world populated by giants, the Quinametsin. But these giants, who were said to have built the great pyramids of Teotihuacan, were judged by the gods to be imperfect. The Quinametsin represented a failed draft of creation, a race judged unworthy to inhabit the new world. To clear the way for a more suitable race, the gods sent jaguars to devour them, wiping the slate clean and ending the first sun in a bloody cataclysm. In this powerful myth, the destruction of the giants was a necessary correction required to create a properly functioning universe. Once the cosmic wars were over and the new order was established, the Age of Monsters became the stuff of history. It was a finished past, a foundational series of events that explained why the world was the way it was. But this past was not entirely gone. It had left behind evidence, scattered across the landscape and buried just beneath the topsoil. To the people of the ancient world, these were the literal, physical remains of the giants and heroes who had fought the great wars of creation. To understand how they reached this conclusion, we must first understand their worldview. The ancient Greeks and Romans operated within a historical worldview defined by myth and human generations. They had no concept of deep time, the staggering multi-million-year spans required for evolution and extinction. The idea that a species of animal could exist and then vanish from the world completely was an alien one. For them, all of history was a single, continuous story, stretching from the age of the gods to the age of heroes to their own present day. Within this framework, myth was the most powerful tool for classification. When a farmer's plow or a collapsing cliff face revealed a bone the size of a man, it had to be explained using the known catalogue of beings who had once walked the earth. Ancient people interpreted these colossal bones as the physical remains of the heroes, monsters, and giants from their own foundational myths. The discovery of a giant femur was tangible proof that the stories of the Titanomachy or the Gigantomachy were true history. The Mediterranean world is a hotbed of tectonic activity, a place where earthquakes and erosion frequently expose the rich fossil beds of the Miocene and Pliocene eras. This region was once home to a staggering variety of megafauna: giant giraffes, mastodons, colossal tortoises, and the same dwarf elephants that gave rise to the Cyclops myth. Their remains, unearthed by the natural churning of the earth, became the raw material for a constant and dynamic process of mythological reinforcement. These ancient discoverers, who collected, measured, and attempted to identify these remains, can be thought of as the world's very first paleontologists. Their methods were observation and logic, but their conclusions were guided by the epic stories that formed the bedrock of their culture. Every bone was a relic, every fossil site a battlefield, and every discovery a fresh and visceral connection to the titanic struggles that had shaped their world. This practice of interpreting fossils through myth is a well-documented historical reality, recorded by the travel writers and encyclopedists of the ancient world. The Greek geographer Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, meticulously catalogued the customs and histories of the Greek mainland. His work is filled with matter-of-fact descriptions of the colossal bones of heroes and giants, displayed with reverence in temples and city centers across the Roman Empire. These discoveries were often treated as events of political and religious significance. The historian Herodotus tells of a time when the Spartans were consistently losing a war with the neighboring Tegeans. The oracle at Delphi advised them that they would only be victorious if they found and reburied the bones of the famed hero Orestes, the son of Agamemnon. A Spartan spy eventually located the body in a blacksmith's forge, describing a coffin containing a man over 10 feet tall. When these bones, almost certainly those of a Pleistocene mammoth, were brought back to Sparta, they were treated as a national treasure, their presence a divine guarantee of the military victory that soon followed. This was a common practice. The Athenians revered the bones of the hero Theseus, whose discovery legitimized the city's political power. The shoulder blade of Pelops, a relic of significant size, was a sacred object kept at Olympia. The Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder writes of the discovery of the skeleton of the giant Orion and confirms that the bones of Orestes were put on public display in Rome. These bones were treated as state treasures, displayed in temples with the same reverence afforded to the cult statues of the gods. This fascination reached the very highest levels of power. The first Roman emperor, Augustus, was an avid collector of fossils. His biographer Suetonius notes that in his imperial villa, he decorated his rooms with the limbs of so-called giants and the weapons of ancient heroes in place of the usual art and statues. Augustus's collection was a carefully curated instrument of imperial propaganda, a display of physical proof for the mythological history of Rome and the tremendous age and power that he now commanded. Certain locations became famous for producing these remains. The island of Samos in the Aegean was legendary for its extensive bone beds, which were so rich that later writers would refer to the fields as a charnel house of bones. To explain the staggering number of colossal fossils, the Samians developed a local myth, claiming the island was once home to a terrifying race of beasts called the Needs, who were annihilated by the hero Dionysus. For the Samians, these bones were the physical evidence that proved their local myth was true. The Temple of Hera on the island became a repository for these remarkable finds, with colossal fossilized bones being put on display as sacred relics, tangible proof of the island's mythic history and the power of the gods. The fusion of fossil evidence and civic identity on Samos is a perfect microcosm of the ancient worldview. These interpretations were the product of a powerful and internally consistent intellectual system, born from reason applied within a different worldview. As we have established, the foundational principle of this system was a world without extinction. Without a mechanism to account for lost species, the bones had to belong to a creature from the known catalogue of existence. Within that framework, the mythological explanation was the most elegant, powerful, and evidence-based solution. It accounted for the bones' massive size. It explained their geographical location on ancient battlefields, and it reinforced the culture's most cherished historical and religious accounts. A farmer who unearthed a colossal femur and a scholar who read Hesiod's account of the Titanomachy were observing two sides of the same coherent reality. The bone proved the story, and the story explained the bone. This created a powerful, self-reinforcing loop. Each new fossil discovery was fresh evidence that solidified the truth of the myths, and the myths provided a ready-made, authoritative framework for understanding each new fossil. Their system of myth provided a comprehensive and emotionally resonant explanation for all the available evidence, leaving no mystery unsolved. Within this intellectual framework, the belief in giants was the most rational and evidence-based conclusion possible. This worldview would dominate Western thought for nearly 2,000 years. The bones of giants were accepted as fact, their remains displayed as sacred relics that connected the present to a heroic and violent past. But these bones were not the only form of physical proof that people saw in the world around them. In the windswept plains and rolling hills of northern Europe, another, even more imposing kind of evidence stood in plain sight: the silent, impossible stone structures that littered the landscape. These impossible stone structures, known as megaliths, presented an unsolvable engineering mystery to the people who lived in their shadows for thousands of years. From the iconic stone circles of Britain to the long avenues of France and the burial dolmens of Spain, these monuments were built by Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples who left behind no written records. For the later inhabitants of these lands, the Iron Age Celts, the Romans, and the medieval farmers, the origins of these structures were completely unknown. They looked upon 40-ton stones, quarried from miles away, raised into perfect alignment with the solstices, and saw a level of engineering so far beyond their own capacities that they could only attribute it to a lost, supernatural power. In a world of wood, leather, and brute human force, the ability to manipulate stone on this scale seemed impossible for mortals. And if normal humans could not have built them, then the conclusion was simple: abnormal humans must have. The giant became the default explanation, the only builder whose imagined strength fit the scale of the evidence. This belief was widespread. At Stonehenge, the medieval chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth claimed the monolithic stones were brought from Ireland by the magic of Merlin and assembled by giants. In Brittany, the even more extensive Karnak alignments, over 3,000 standing stones arranged in perfect rows stretching for miles, were explained as a Roman legion that had been petrified by a local saint. But in the older, deeper folklore, they were the work of giants, the stones serving as the markers for a colossal battlefield, or the fence posts for a giant's farm. These stories served the same function as the mythological explanations for fossils. They provided a satisfying and logical explanation for a physical mystery. The folklore transformed the silent, empty landscapes of Europe into a living history book. A farmer tending his flock amidst a field of dolmens was walking through a giant's graveyard. A traveler passing a towering standing stone was looking upon a javelin thrown in a primordial war. The myths gave the impossible structures a name, a purpose, and a place within a coherent, story-shaped world. This need to give the world a story-shaped coherence extended beyond man-made structures to the very landscape itself. Nowhere is this more apparent than on the rugged northern coast of Ireland, home to one of the most otherworldly geological formations on the planet, the Giant's Causeway. It is a sprawling pavement of some 40,000 interlocking basalt columns, most of them perfect hexagons, stepping down from the foot of a cliff and disappearing under the sea. The columns display a geometric perfection that seems to defy the chaos of natural erosion, appearing for all the world like a deliberately constructed road built for a being of huge scale. To the people of ancient Ireland, that is precisely what it was. The folklore that grew around this incredible formation is a tale of a classic giant rivalry. The story tells of the great Irish giant, Finn McCool, a hero who represented a combination of prodigious strength and cunning intelligence. From his home in Antrim, he could see across the sea to Scotland, the home of his rival, the brutish giant Benandonna. After a series of insults were shouted across the water, Finn resolved to settle the matter once and for all. He tore massive columns of rock from the cliffs and drove them into the seabed, creating a grand stone causeway that he could walk across to face his enemy. The story, however, takes a famous turn. As Finn strode across his newly built road, he saw Benandonna coming to meet him and realized, to his horror, that his rival was far, far larger than he had anticipated. In a panic, Finn retreated back to Ireland and confessed his fear to his quick-witted wife, Una. She quickly disguised her giant husband, wrapping him in a blanket and placing him in an enormous, custom-built cradle. When the colossal Benandonna arrived, roaring for Finn, Una calmly greeted him and told him that Finn was out, but he should be quiet so as not to wake the baby. Benandonna looked into the cradle and saw the enormous form of the disguised Finn McCool. Struck with terror at the thought of how large the father must be if this was the size of his infant son, the Scottish giant turned and fled for his life. In his panicked retreat, he smashed the causeway behind him, leaving only the remnants we see today on the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. This charming story is a brilliant piece of folk ingenuity. It provides a complete narrative that explains the causeway's artificial appearance, its name, and its ruined, broken state. And like the myth of the Cyclops, it is a logical, story-based explanation for a real and very strange geological phenomenon. The Giant's Causeway is a natural wonder, the result of a thick basalt lava flow cooling slowly and contracting. As the lava cooled from the top down, it cracked along geometric stress lines, forming the near-perfect hexagonal columns that make the site so famous. It is a myth born from the stunning clockwork mathematics of geology, a story created to give a human face to an inhumanly perfect landscape. The impulse to find a human story in an inhuman landscape is as old as humanity itself. But as the world moved from the age of myth into the age of discovery, this impulse took on a new and feverish intensity. It was an era of unprecedented exploration and scientific inquiry, but it was also an age of grand spectacle, where the line between education and entertainment was often blurred. This was a world hungry for wonders, and the giant, once a figure of myth and folklore, was about to be reborn as an object of intense scientific curiosity and commercial exploitation. This transition began in the dimly lit studies of Renaissance princes and Enlightenment scholars, in the collections known as Cabinets of Curiosity, or Wunderkammern. These rooms were private museums, attempts to create a microcosm of the entire world, with its every marvel and mystery gathered under one roof. Here, a narwhal's tusk was displayed as a unicorn's horn, a nautilus shell sat beside a Roman coin, and, invariably, a massive fossilized bone, a mammoth's femur, or a mastodon's rib, would be labeled as the remains of a biblical giant or a hero of antiquity. In these displays, the giant took its place as a tangible, semi-scientific fact, its reality vouched for by its proximity to genuine natural wonders. What began in the private collections of the elite soon exploded into the public consciousness with the birth of mass media. The rise of the penny press in the 19th century created a voracious public appetite for sensational stories. The primary goal of these new, inexpensive newspapers was to capture the public's imagination through a mixture of factual reporting, entertainment, and shocking spectacle. And few subjects sold more papers than the discovery of a giant skeleton. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and particularly in the United States, local newspapers were filled with breathless and often entirely fabricated accounts of enormous skeletons being unearthed by farmers or miners. Reports of 9, 10, or even 12-foot tall human remains, often described as having double rows of teeth, became a journalistic staple. These stories created a powerful feedback loop. The old belief in giants, reinforced by the scientific evidence in curiosity cabinets, was now amplified and legitimized by the seemingly objective authority of the printed word. This constant drumbeat of discoveries created a cultural environment where the public was primed to believe and eager to pay for the ultimate proof. This environment, primed for belief in a lost race of giants, found its perfect subject in the sweeping, mysterious landscapes of the American frontier. As the 18th and 19th century settlers pushed west into the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, they encountered a deep and unsettling mystery. The very land they were claiming, a land they believed to be a pristine wilderness inhabited by primitive nomads, was in fact littered with the ruins of a monumental, ancient civilization. Across the landscape were thousands of enormous, man-made earthworks. Some were conical burial mounds, others were massive, flat-topped platform mounds that had once served as the foundations for great temples. Many were enormous geometric enclosures, perfect circles, squares, and octagons of a scale and precision that seemed to defy the capabilities of a pre-industrial people. These were sophisticated, multi-purpose structures, serving as ceremonial centers, burial sites, and complex astronomical observatories. A powerful and compelling story that would serve a far darker ideological purpose than simple wonder and speculation. This dark ideological purpose was the complete and total erasure of Native American history from the American landscape. The Mound Builder myth provided a convenient and powerful fiction that served the political goals of the young United States. This pseudo-archaeological theory was a potent political tool, a foundational story for the policy of westward expansion and the concept of manifest destiny. The logic of the myth was as simple as it was brutal. By claiming the magnificent earthworks were built by a separate, vanished, and implicitly superior race, it erased the ancestral claim of the current Native American tribes. They were cast as recent, savage interlopers who had themselves conquered and destroyed the original, civilized mound builders. This narrative transformed the act of settler colonialism into a righteous act of revenge, a reclaiming of the land on behalf of its original, lost architects. This idea was a mainstream belief, promoted by popular authors, amateur archaeologists, and prominent politicians. It provided a powerful moral and historical justification for the policies of Indian removal. When President Andrew Jackson forcibly displaced the 5 civilized tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Mound Builder myth was a key part of the intellectual scaffolding that supported his actions. It allowed the government and the public to believe they were removing recent usurpers, not dispossessing a people from the land their ancestors had shaped for 1,000 years. The newspaper reports of giant skeletons being unearthed from the mounds played a crucial role in this process. Each new discovery was presented as fresh proof of this lost, noble race. Ironically, the myth often painted these giants as peaceful, sophisticated artisans and farmers, a stark contrast to the warlike stereotype of the modern tribes. This allowed popular writers to craft a storyline of tragic extinction. The story went that the gentle, civilized race of giants had been wiped out in a genocidal war by the savage ancestors of the modern Native Americans. In this telling, the giants were the victims, and the Native Americans were the villains. This inversion of victimhood was the myth's most powerful and insidious function. It effectively laundered the guilt of westward expansion. By claiming that the Native Americans had committed a terrible, ancient crime, the myth implicitly justified any crime that was then being committed against them. The easiest way to steal a people's past is to invent a more spectacular one to put in its place. The story of the lost race of mound-building giants was the perfect tool for the job. It was a grand, romantic, and tragic fiction that served to erase a real and inconvenient history. This grand and tragic fiction held sway over the American imagination for the better part of a century. But as the 19th century drew to a close, the burgeoning field of professional, institutional science began to push back. The task of finally solving the mystery of the mounds fell to a new government agency, established for the precise purpose of studying the peoples and cultures of the continent, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology. The Bureau was led by the geologist and explorer John Wesley Powell, a man who had famously navigated the Grand Canyon and held a deep, first-hand respect for the complexity of Native American cultures. Powell was deeply skeptical of the mound builder myth, viewing it as a romantic and dangerous fantasy. In 1882, he tasked a self-taught but brilliant archaeologist named Cyrus Thomas with a monumental project: to conduct a definitive nationwide survey of the earthworks and either prove or disprove the myth once and for all. Cyrus Thomas's approach was defined by a new standard of empirical rigor, launching the most extensive and systematic archaeological survey in American history up to that point. For over a decade, He and his teams investigated more than 2,000 mound sites across 24 states. Their work went far beyond simply digging for sensational skeletons. They meticulously mapped the sites, documented the stratigraphy, and, most importantly, collected the cultural artifacts found within the mounds. The evidence they gathered was overwhelming and irrefutable. The artifacts found in the mounds, the pottery, the arrowheads, the ceremonial objects, were all clear and direct precursors to the material culture of the very same Native American tribes who were still living in the regions. Thomas found no evidence of a vanished, superior race. Instead, he found a clear, unbroken line of cultural continuity stretching from the past to the present. The skeletons themselves told a similar story. While some were indeed large, they were all within the normal range of human height, and the sensationalist claims of 9 or 10-foot giants were found to be either gross exaggerations or outright fabrications. There was no lost race of giants. There was only a rich and complex history of indigenous American achievement. In 1894, Thomas published his findings in a massive report for the Smithsonian, running over 700 pages. His conclusion was stated with the blunt, unequivocal force of a scientific verdict. The theory of a lost race of mound builders was, in his words, entirely destitute of foundation. The mounds, he proved, were built by the ancestors of the modern Native American tribes. It was a landmark moment in the history of American archaeology, a definitive scientific statement that dismantled a century of racist fiction and began the long, slow process of restoring a stolen history to its rightful owners. While the Smithsonian was methodically restoring a stolen history, a tobacconist from Binghamton, New York, was busy inventing a completely fraudulent one. The Cardiff Giant, the discovery of which opened our story, was not a widely held folk belief that grew over centuries. It was a deliberate, calculated, and brilliantly executed deception, born from the mind of a single, disgruntled man, George Hull. Hull was a committed atheist, a controversial stance in the mid-19th century, particularly in his home of upstate New York. This region was known as the Burned-Over District for the intense waves of religious revivalism that had swept through it, leaving a culture of fervent, literalist faith. Hull, who admired science and reason, was actively angered by what he perceived as the blind, unthinking faith of his community. The breaking point, according to the story, came during an argument at a Methodist revival meeting with a preacher named Reverend Turk. The argument centered on the very same biblical passage that had fueled the myth of the Nephilim, Genesis 6:4, which states that there were giants in the earth in those days. The Reverend insisted that this, like the rest of the Bible, must be taken as literal, historical fact. Hull, the skeptic, was outnumbered and lost the argument, left infuriated by the credulity of those around him. This defeat planted the seed of an idea. It was a plan that would serve two purposes. It would be a get-rich-quick scheme, but more importantly, it would be a grand, satirical joke designed to prove a point. Hull wanted to demonstrate how easily people could be fooled by their own religious devotion. He resolved to create his own biblical proof, a petrified giant so convincing that it would trap the faithful in their own literalism, making a mockery of their beliefs while making him a fortune in the process. To make his convincing giant, George Hull needed a convincing raw material. In 1868, he traveled to Fort Dodge, Iowa, excavation pit and began charging 50 cents admission for a 15-minute viewing. The public response was overwhelming. In the first few days, hundreds and then thousands of people flocked to the small farm. Farmers, merchants, socialites, and scholars traveled by horse, by wagon, and by special excursion trains, all eager to gaze upon what was being called a new wonder of the world. For the religiously devout, this was more than a wonder. It was a vindication. The discovery, in the heart of the burned-over district, was seen as divine confirmation of the literal truth of the Bible. Preachers and theologians descended on the farm, delivering sermons beside the pit and proclaiming the giant as definitive proof of Genesis 6, a genuine remnant of the antediluvian world. The Newell Farm was transformed from a site of curiosity into a destination for religious pilgrimage. George Hull's joke was working perfectly. The scientific community was far more skeptical, but also deeply divided. The nascent sciences of geology and paleontology in America had no established framework for such a discovery. The initial public debate was a contest between two forms of belief: a religious belief in a petrified biblical giant, and a scientific belief in an authentic, ancient statue, perhaps carved by a lost Jesuit mission centuries ago. Few in the early days dared to suggest the third, and true, possibility that it was a modern fake. One of the most prominent early supporters was the New York State geologist James Hall, who examined the giant and declared it the most remarkable object yet brought to light in this country, an opinion which lent the discovery a powerful veneer of scientific legitimacy. Others, however, began to have doubts, noting the freshness of the tool marks and the type of stone. This mixture of awe, faith, and controversy was pure fuel for the national media. The penny press, which had for years primed the public with stories of giant skeletons, now had its ultimate story. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco ran sensational headlines, dispatching reporters and illustrators to capture the scene. The Cardiff giant was no longer a local curiosity. It was a national obsession, a story debated in every tavern, parlor, and university in the country. The phenomenon took on a life of its own. The 50-cent admission fee was soon raised to $1. An entire cottage industry of sideshows, food vendors, and souvenir stands sprang up around the Newell Farm. The giant had become one of America's first and greatest tourist attractions, and for George Hull, watching from the wings, the streams of cash pouring in were just as beautiful as the streams of gullible pilgrim. Such a lucrative and popular spectacle could not escape the notice of the 19th century's undisputed king of public entertainment, the renowned showman Phineas T. Barnum. Barnum, the proprietor of the American Museum in New York City, immediately recognized the giant's commercial potential. He approached the syndicate that now owned the giant and made them a stunning offer: $50,000, the equivalent of over $1 million today, to lease the figure for his museum. When his massive offer was rebuffed, Barnum, unwilling to be denied, resorted to his signature brand of cunning showmanship. He hired an agent to secretly visit Cardiff and sketch the giant in meticulous detail. From these drawings, Barnum commissioned his own perfect replica, a masterful copy of the original. He then began exhibiting his version in New York, proclaiming it to be the real Cardiff giant and dismissing the original, which had since been moved to Syracuse, as a cheap imitation. This created a sublime and uniquely American spectacle, a fake of a fake, with both drawing massive crowds and their owners publicly accusing each other of being frauds. While Barnum and Hull's syndicate were battling for the public's money, a far more serious threat to their enterprise was emerging from the world of academic science. The debate over the giant's authenticity had attracted the attention of Othniel Charles Marsh, a professor of paleontology at Yale University and the founder of the Peabody Museum of Natural History. As a professionally trained paleontologist, Marsh possessed the scientific expertise to immediately recognize the telltale signs of a man-made fraud. During a brief viewing of the giant in Syracuse, Marsh conducted a careful examination. He instantly noted that the giant was made of soluble gypsum, a stone that could never have survived for centuries, buried in the damp New York soil. More damningly, he observed a series of parallel lines and tool marks just beneath the giant's surface, proof that it had been worked by a carver's chisel. And he saw that the figure's weathering was unnaturally uniform, completely unlike the patterns of genuine erosion. His inspection lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough. Marsh left the exhibit and immediately dictated a letter to a local newspaper, exposing the entire affair. He declared the giant to be of very recent origin and a most decided humbug. Coming from one of the nation's most respected paleontologists, the verdict was a fatal blow. The scientific authority of Yale and the cultural authority of Othniel Marsh were far more powerful than the opinions of local preachers or amateur geologists. The expert had finally spoken, and his judgment was clear, concise, and backed by the full weight of his discipline. The American Goliath had been officially and irrevocably debunked. The joke was over. With the scientific verdict delivered and the public's belief beginning to curdle into suspicion, the conspiracy behind the giant quickly unraveled. Facing mounting pressure and public ridicule, the conspirators began to talk. Finally, in a series of newspaper interviews, George Hull himself came forward and confessed to the entire affair, detailing with great pride the story of his argument with the preacher, the quarrying in Iowa, the secret carving in Chicago, and the final burial on his cousin's farm. Hull never expressed a shred of guilt for his grand deception. On the contrary, he was immensely proud of it. His joke had worked more perfectly than he could have ever imagined. He had set out to prove that the American people were, in his words, a gullible lot, and their fervent, almost desperate willingness to believe in his petrified man had proven his point beyond all doubt. He had made his fortune, but more importantly, he had won his argument with Reverend Turk in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The legacy of the Cardiff Giant is a complex one. As a hoax, it was a spectacular success, but as a long-term business, it was a failure. Once the truth was out, the public's fascination evaporated, and the giant became a traveling sideshow curiosity, its power to inspire awe and wonder gone forever. It eventually found a permanent home in the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York, not far from where it was first discovered, where it remains to this day. Yet the story endures because the hoax itself tells a powerful truth. The giant's true legacy lies in its function as a cultural mirror, reflecting the nation's own complex mixture of piety, scientific curiosity, commercial hustle, and a deep, almost primal willingness to believe in something larger than itself. P.T. Barnum himself famously summed it up, remarking that a fake giant that was honestly advertised as a fake would still draw a crowd, because the public enjoyed being fooled. The Cardiff Giant's true story was about the American people. It revealed a deep-seated desire for the world to be more mysterious, more ancient, and more magical than it really was. The petrified man in the ground was a lie, but the cordoned off the site. The authority of the digital photograph felt, to many, as real and irrefutable as a block of stone. Soon, the myth evolved further. As skeptics repeatedly debunked the image by tracing it back to the art contest, the story mutated. It shifted its focus from the image itself to the new story of a conspiracy in which a respected scientific institution was actively suppressing the truth. The Smithsonian Institution, the very same body that had authoritatively debunked the mound builder myth, was now cast as the villain. The new claim was that the Smithsonian had been secretly finding giant skeletons for decades, but was systematically destroying them to protect the established Darwinian model of human evolution. The photoshopped image was no longer the discovery, it was the leaked proof of the cover-up. This was the masterstroke of the modern hoax. It co-opted the very act of debunking into its own mythology. Any attempt to prove the photo was a fake was simply more evidence of how deep the conspiracy went. It was a hoax that had become perfectly immune to facts, a digital ghost that continues to haunt the internet to this day. The fact-immune hoaxes of the digital age are a modern symptom of an ancient way of thinking. But before these myths could be truly challenged, the very framework of history had to be rebuilt. The intellectual revolution that would ultimately dethrone the giants began in the halls of the Natural History Museum in Paris, with a man who would teach the world to see the past with new eyes: Georges Cuvier. Working in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Cuvier was the world's leading authority on animal anatomy. His laboratory was situated in a perfect location for discovery. The city of Paris itself is built atop a massive geological depression, the Paris Basin, which is one of the richest and most accessible fossil beds on Earth. As the city's quarries and mines expanded, they constantly unearthed the strange and unfamiliar bones of prehistoric creatures. Cuvier's insight was to see each bone as an integral part of a larger, functional, and perfectly interconnected biological system. He pioneered the science of comparative anatomy, establishing the principle that every part of an animal is precisely correlated to every other part. The shape of a tooth dictates the shape of the jaw, which dictates the muscles of the skull, which dictates the posture of the neck and the form of the vertebrae. Using this principle, Cuvier could take a single, fossilized bone fragment and, with almost perfect accuracy, reconstruct the entire animal it belonged to. Applying this rigorous method to the bones being unearthed around Paris and to the mammoth bones being sent from North America, Cuvier reached a startling and world-altering conclusion. He proved, conclusively, that these bones belonged to species of elephant that were related to, but distinct from, the living elephants of Africa and India. These creatures had once roamed the earth, and now they were gone. His work was the first definitive scientific proof of a concept that we now take for granted, but which was revolutionary at the time: the reality of extinction. The reality of extinction was a devastating blow to the old worldview. It shattered the single, unbroken timeline that stretched from the Garden of Eden to the present day. If entire species could vanish, then history was not one continuous chronicle. Cuvier's work transformed our understanding of the past from a single volume into a multi-chaptered library with entire sections whose contents had been completely lost to human memory. To explain these disappearances, Cuvier championed a theory known as catastrophism. He looked at the geological strata of the Paris Basin with their distinct layers of fossils and concluded that the history of the Earth was not a gentle, gradual process. Instead, he proposed a series of sudden, violent, and revolutionary catastrophes, great floods or geological upheavals that had wiped out all life in a given region, which would then be repopulated by new species. This idea of former ages and lost worlds provided the crucial intellectual framework needed to finally understand the giant bones. They were not the remains of titans, heroes, or Nephilim who had lived a few dozen generations ago. They were the inhabitants of a completely different, vanished ecosystem, a world before humanity, with its own unique and now extinct cast of characters. The concept of extinction created a new, scientific category into which the old evidence could finally be placed. Cuvier's work fundamentally changed the question. The old question was, which hero or giant from our stories did this bone belong to? The new scientific question became, what kind of extinct animal did this bone belong to, and what was its world like? It was a paradigm shift of huge proportions. This revolution in thought dethroned myth from its position as a tool of historical classification. The stories of titans and heroes were moved from the library of history to the library of literature and folklore. The giant bones were no longer proof of their reality. Instead, the bones themselves became the central mystery, the primary text, and science, not myth, would be the tool used to read it. With the intellectual framework of extinction now in place, the project of scientific re-examination could begin. Throughout the 19th century, paleontologists began to apply Cuvier's methods to the legendary giant bones that had been revered as relics for millennia. They returned to the very same evidence that had once proven the reality of titans and heroes, but they now read that evidence with a new and powerful understanding. The scientific re-examination of the giant bones revealed them to be the remains of colossal, extinct mammals, primarily the mammoth and the mastodon. These Ice Age proboscideans, relatives of the modern elephant, were perfectly suited to the role of the mythical giant. Their leg bones were enormous and superficially human-like. Their shoulder blades could be mistaken for giant pelvic bones, and their sheer scale dwarfed any living land animal known to Europeans. The Cyclops skull, found on the islands of the Mediterranean, was now definitively identified as that of a prehistoric dwarf elephant, its central eye socket correctly reinterpreted as its nasal cavity. The gigantic bones of Orestes, revered by the Spartans, and the giant limbs collected by Emperor Augustus were all recognized as the remains of these imposing, shaggy beasts who had once dominated a colder, wilder world. It was not just mammoths. Science soon revealed that the world before man had been populated by an entire bestiary of colossal creatures, a category of life now known as megafauna. The bones of the giant sloth, the cave bear, the woolly rhinoceros, all had, at one time or another, been mistaken for the remains of giants, dragons, or monsters. Each reclassification was another nail in the coffin of the old worldview. The giants of myth were, in a sense, killed for a second time. Their first death had been at the hands of the gods and heroes of legend. Their second and final death was at the hands of the scientists, a death by measurement, classification, and labeling. They were banished from the realm of history and transformed into a data point, a fascinating but entirely mistaken footnote in the long story of the Earth. And as the 19th century fascination with must support is proportional to its body's total volume. This means if you were to double the height of a human being, the strength of their bones would increase by a factor of 4, but their body weight would increase by a factor of 8. Their skeleton would suddenly be twice as weak relative to the load it had to carry. Now, apply this to the giants of myth. Let us take a 6-foot-tall man and scale him up to a height of 30 feet, a 5-fold increase. The cross-sectional area of his bones would increase by the square of 5, making them 25 times stronger. But his volume and mass would increase by the cube of 5, making him 125 times heavier. The math doesn't work. Such a creature would be a physical impossibility, a prisoner of its own scale. Its legs would shatter under the tremendous load of its own body. The giant is a paradox, crushed by its own biology before it can even stand. The giants of myth are not just biologically unlikely, they are a dream of scale that is fundamentally incompatible with the laws that govern our three-dimensional world. While the laws of physics make the 30-foot giant of myth an impossibility, the human world is not without its own real-life giants. But these are not a separate race of beings. They are modern humans whose extraordinary size is the result of a serious, life-altering medical condition known as pathological gigantism. This condition is typically caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland, the body's master controller of growth. This tumor causes the gland to produce an enormous excess of growth hormone, leading to continuous, uncontrolled growth long after a person would normally have reached their adult height. The most well-documented case in modern history, and the tallest human being whose height is medically verified, was Robert Wadlow. Born in Alton, Illinois in 1918, Wadlow was of normal size at birth, but a hyperactive pituitary gland soon spurred his incredible growth. By the age of 8, he was taller than his father. By 17, he had passed 8 feet in height. At the time of his death, at the tragically young age of 22, he stood 8 feet, 11 inches tall, and showed no signs of stopping. Robert Wadlow's life was a living demonstration of the tyranny of the square cube law. Though celebrated for his gentle disposition, his towering size came at a devastating physiological cost. His circulatory system struggled to pump blood to his extremities, causing him to have little feeling in his feet. His bones, even though they were huge, were not strong enough to support his nearly 500-pound weight, forcing him to wear heavy leg braces just to walk. It was an infection from one of these leg braces that would ultimately lead to his premature death. His story, and the story of every human with pathological gigantism, proves the point. The human body is a finely tuned system designed to operate within a specific range of scale. To push beyond that range is to enter a state of critical biological crisis. The real giants of our world are figures of human fragility to be understood, a final, poignant confirmation that the giants of our imagination can only ever exist in the realm of the story. If the giants of our imagination can only exist in the realm of the story, then the final and deepest question is, why do we tell this story? Why, across thousands of years and countless cultures, have we consistently populated our world with these colossal beings? The answer lies in the very architecture of the minds that interpret that evidence. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine. For millennia, our survival depended on our ability to quickly make sense of a complex and dangerous world, often with incomplete information. This evolutionary pressure has equipped us with a set of powerful cognitive biases, mental shortcuts that help us find meaning and order in the chaos. This cognitive tendency is a deeply embedded evolutionary trait, a vital tool for survival. Two of these biases, in particular, form a powerful cognitive engine for the creation of giants. The first is pareidolia, the universal human tendency to perceive a meaningful pattern, like a face, in a vague or random stimulus. It's why we see animals in the clouds, or the man in the moon. For our ancestors, the survival cost of failing to spot a predator hiding in the bushes was far higher than the cost of occasionally mistaking a rock for a bear. Our brains are therefore hardwired to find bodies and faces, even where none exist. And when we look at an ancient mountain range, with its sleeping profile and its stony limbs, our minds are powerfully predisposed to see the body of a giant. The second bias is agency detection. This is our deep-seated instinct to assume that any unexplained event is the result of a conscious, intelligent agent. A rustle in the grass is a predator. A sudden rockfall is an attack. A storm is the rage of a celestial being. For our ancestors, assuming agency and being wrong was a minor error. Failing to assume agency and being wrong could be fatal. We are therefore primed to attribute intent, personality, and will to the impersonal forces of nature. When these two cognitive tools work in concert, the result is the birth of a giant. Pareidolia gives the inhuman landscape a human-like body. Agency detection gives that body a mind, a will, and intentions. A mountain range is no longer just a pile of rock. It is a sleeping giant who might one day awaken. An earthquake is no longer a random geological event. It is the stirring of the being who slumbers beneath the earth. These cognitive biases are the ghost in the machine, the innate human impulse to project a human story onto an inhuman world. And the giant is the most logical and powerful protagonist for that story. This impulse to project a human story onto the landscape explains the origin of the giant, but it does not fully explain its enduring power as an archetype. The giant is more than just a personified mountain. It is a profound psychological symbol. In countless myths, the giant functions as a living symbol of the boundary, the line that separates the known world from the terrifying unknown. First, the giant represents the boundary between civilization and the untamed wilderness. Human societies are safe, ordered spaces carved out of a chaotic and indifferent natural world. The giant is the personification of that chaos. He is the destructive power of an earthquake, the brute force of a landslide, the untamed energy of the forest. He dwells just beyond the city walls, in the dark woods or the high mountains, a constant reminder of the fragile border between our world of order and the boundless, untamed world of nature. Second, the giant represents the boundary between the present and the past. As we have seen in the stories of the Titans, the Jotnar, and the Fomorians, the giant is almost always a figure of a bygone era. They are the primordial beings who had to be defeated and cleared away to make room for the current, more civilized world of gods and men. They embody the chaotic, violent, and untamed past. To tell a story about defeating a giant is to tell a story about the victory of the present over the past, of order over chaos, of intellect over brute force. This archetype gives us a way to conceptualize our own cultural and psychological evolution. The defeated giant is a monument to our own progress, a symbol of the primitive forces, both external and internal, that we believe we have overcome to become who we are. This makes the giant an essential tool for defining what it means to be human. The lawless, cannibalistic Cyclops helps define the civilized Greek, who is bound by the laws of hospitality. The brutish Goliath helps define the faithful Israelite, whose strength comes from God, not muscle. The giant is the ultimate other, the perfect, monstrous background against which humanity can paint its